Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm your host for this episode, Jared Zimmer, the Director of Outreach and Mission here at Word on Fire. And as always, I'm joined by the illustrious Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop, how are you doing today?
Hey, Jared, I'm doing well. Always good to be with you.
Wonderful. Well, recently you had the opportunity to film a new study program surrounding the Mass. Can you tell us a little bit how it went and maybe a little bit of a sneak peek?
Yeah, well, those are always, they're fun. They're also long and demanding days. So we gathered about 1,000 people at the Church of Our Lady of Sorrows right here in downtown Santa Barbara, one of the most beautiful churches here. And people came from all over the area. And then I came out and did 6 roughly 20-minute presentations, and they were filmed by the great Spirit Juice production company, who have done a number of videos for us. And I hope those will be out, maybe like a year from now. We got to go through the whole process now of editing those and adding imagery and music and study programs and so on. But my hope is that it can be used in a wide variety of settings because, the Mass is the source and summit of the Christian life. Anyone becoming a Catholic, anyone seeking a deeper understanding of their Catholicism should, want to study the Mass. So anyway, that was last Saturday? So it was a good day, but as I say, kind of a hard day, but I hope that it bears fruit.
Well, speaking of the Mass and sacraments, kind of going right into our main topic of discussion today, we recently had the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, of course, when, Martin Luther famously came forth with his 95 Theses. Bishop, what was your initial thoughts on really the importance of this 500-year anniversary?
Well, the Reformation, I think, is of great interest to anyone who follows the great prayer of Jesus that we all might be one. So in the measure that the Reformation was a church-dividing event, and still is, that should be on the minds and the hearts of all Christians. In that sense, Jared, I wouldn't say the Reformation is something we ought to be celebrating. It's like a divorce. It's like a rupture. On the other hand, I think a lot of good came from the Reformation, and some wonderful figures at that time and then in the ensuing centuries have made a huge contribution to the way we understand Christianity. And so I wouldn't want to simply write it off as all just, a lot of rebellious nonsense. So it's tricky to talk about the Reformation because it's both good and bad, I think. Legitimate reform, yeah, to some degree. Church dividing divorce, yeah, to some degree. And it's both those things.
Yeah, one of my favorite authors is Hilaire Belloc, and he actually said that it was one of the most shocking events to culture since the founding of Christianity. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, to a degree. Belloc tends to overstate things. But I think, sure, there is that rupturing sort of element. There's that culture-changing element. You might say, the world of medieval Catholicism definitively ends at that time. Those of us who revere medieval Catholicism, mourn that. But at the same time, I think I'd be a little more sanguine than Hilaire Belloc about the Reformation. And, we'll get into this a bit, but it's hard to read Vatican II without seeing it as, in a pretty substantial way, not accepting the Reformation, but at least nodding in the direction of the Reformation. I think it's hard to read Vatican II without seeing how it doesn't embrace the Reformation, but it at least nods toward the Reformation. And so I think if we're going to be followers of Vatican II, as we should be, you can't be simply one-sidedly negative about the Reformation.
Yeah, and one article that recently came out because of the 500th anniversary that really went viral was by Stanley Hauerwas. It was entitled, The Reformation is Over, Protestants Won, So Why Are We Still Here? And I think first off, we're going to discuss this article because I think it gives a really good perspective from a Protestant perspective on the Reformation, but also for us to consider as Catholics, to consider that viewpoint of the Reformation. But to begin, really, to give it a little bit of background, who is Stanley Hauerwas?
Well, Stanley Hauerwas is one of the most interesting Christian theologians writing today. He's been on the scene, probably for about 50 years now. Hauerwas is a Protestant thinker from Texas, but very early on in his career, he got very interested in Catholicism. In fact, he taught at the University of Notre Dame for quite a while, became very well acquainted with Catholic thought, a dialogue partner of David Burrell, who was for many years a professor of philosophy and theology at Notre Dame, someone that I've admired for a long time. And so he's a kind of ecumenical thing, Protestant in some way a fierce one, and at the same time deeply sympathetic with elements within Catholicism. He's also one of the sharpest and wittiest writers in theology. I've told people over the years that if you're interested in kind of getting into theology and you think, oh, it's just sort of tiresome academic writing, pick up anything by Stanley Hauerwas, and you're going to find it kind of crackling and sparkling. He's that way himself. I've had the privilege of knowing him. I'm not real well, but I've been with him on a number of occasions, and he's a lot of fun. He has got a super sharp mind. He's got a very edgy sort of wit about him. There's a playfulness to him, and all that comes through in his writings. So he's someone that I've kind of savored. I'll say this too: another great admirer of Stanley Hauerwas was Cardinal George. In fact, the big Hauerwas reader, which is probably, I don't know, 600 or 700 pages long, has a preface by Cardinal George.
Yeah, in the article, it actually comes out very apparent that he's Catholic friendly. Just to quote him real quick, he says, "Perhaps tellingly, a number of my Protestant graduate students have become Roman Catholics over the years. So many crossed the Tiber that many of my colleagues joked that I was an agent for the Opus Dei." And he considers this. He says they convert because Catholicism is an intellectually rich theological tradition, better able to negotiate the acids of our culture. And I'm sure you totally agree with that.
Yeah, and see, the thing about Hauerwas too, he's a great advocate of nonviolence. He's a strict pacifist, and he's been very sensitive to the ways that the culture co-opts Christianity. So he likes a very vibrant, well-defined, and if you want to put it this way, culturally antagonistic Christianity in a good way. A church that really stands against our secular and, in his mind, very violent culture. So yeah, he sees that in all forms of Christianity at its best, I think. And he would see in the Catholic intellectual tradition the means to articulate this Christian distinctiveness in a way that is helpful in our cultural context. So that quote is right along Hauerwas lines.
Yeah, and just to pull another quote to see if you perhaps agree with this assessment, he says that 500 years after its inception, we are witnessing the end of the Reformation. The very name Protestant suggests a protest movement aimed at the reform of a church that now bears the name Roman Catholicism. But the reality is that the Reformation worked. Most of the reforms Protestants wanted Catholics to make have been made. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's where I'd part company with him. I'd say an emphatic yes and no to that. Have many of the reforms suggested by Luther and their colleagues been to the degree accepted within Roman Catholicism? Yes. Now, take a look at Vatican II. Did Vatican II put a special stress on the importance of the Word? Absolutely. The Word of God is re-emphasized by Vatican II. Now, not at the expense of the sacrificial dimension of the Mass, but it reintroduces the importance of the Word. Does Vatican II stress the priesthood of all believers? Yeah, which is a very strong theme in the Reformers. At the expense of the ministerial priesthood? No, that's clearly affirmed as well, but a strong nod in the direction of the priesthood of all believers. Relatedly, the universal call to holiness. Was that something we find in the Reformers? Yes. They were worried that, holiness was sort of the preserve of the clergy alone or the monks alone. And the ordinary people, didn't have access to that sort of thing. So Luther throws open the doors and says, no, everyone's called to holiness. Vatican confirm that? You bet it does. Now, it doesn't jettison monks and the priesthood, et cetera, et cetera. So, here's another very practical one. One of the things that Luther most wanted was communion under both forms. He felt that in his day, only the priest received under both forms, and that was denying something key to the laity. Well, in the wake of Vatican II, the Catholic Church now liberally offers communion under both forms. So, in all these ways and many others I could specify, the Church did say a kind of qualified yes to the Reformation. So to that degree, have we accepted some of their reforms? Yeah, sure. Now, here's where I balk, and you were getting some of it in my answer, I hope. But to make it more explicit, would the Catholic Church say with Martin Luther that it's fide sola that we're saved, by faith alone, gratia sola, by grace alone? We don't know that. Council of Trent, even as it acknowledges what's right in Luther, clearly draws back from that and talks about the cooperation with grace that happens through our good works. Do we hold Luther's view of original sin and total depravity? No, we clearly don't. Read Trent on the nature of original sin. We pull back from that view. So you might say, with regard to some of the really, really central teachings of the Reformation, the Church said and continues to say a pretty emphatic no to it. So there, I don't think Hauerwas is right to say that, the Protestants simply won, that we took in all their criticisms. I think we, over the centuries, in a more mitigated way, have appropriated certain dimensions of the Protestant critique, and I would say gratefully so, So that's my quick response to a whole subtle set of questions there. It's both yes and no.
And throughout the article, he gives several reasons as to why he actually hasn't become Catholic himself. But one thing that he touches on within it is the fact that the Reformation at its heart, it comes down to a recovery of the centrality of Christ for making sense of why Christians are not home in this world. And he states that emphasis turns out to be the overriding insight that shaped the work of Vatican II, meaning Catholics have overcome the major thrust of the Reformation. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and again, I would say a somewhat qualified yes. I've talked, Jared, a lot about the primacy of grace principle, which is biblical, which is in the best of the Catholic tradition. I think around the time of the Reformation, it was in some danger, that principle. There was a real danger that we were seeing salvation as a matter of primarily of our works, of our spiritual accomplishment, even, let's say, at the limit, something that you could buying an indulgence for a relative, etc. Was Luther right in battling that and reaffirming the centrality of Christ and his grace? Yes, I would say. Now, here's where I differ. Gratia prima, yes, grace first, but not gratia sola. That's where I think Luther went too far. And when the great Catholic theologians who engaged him in the 16th century argued just that. Does the church become simply a matter of secondary consideration? Well, no, I would say as a Catholic that it's by now full incorporation into Christ's mystical body that we experience the fullness of redemption. So the sharp either-ors of the Reformation is what the church balked at. But I think Hauerwas is making a very good point here, that the centrality of Christ, or I'd say the priority or primacy of Christ, needed to be emphasized at Luther's time, and I think he did that. But he kind of overdid it, and the church reacted. So that's, again, my yes and no to Hauerwas.
Yeah, and then one of the beautiful things about the article, and I think particularly of Hauerwas, is he is very balanced. I mean, at the same time, he's praising the Reformation, but then also he does point out a little bit of a problem. And to quote him, he says that the Reformation has been a success, however, has put Protestantism in a crisis. He says, winning is dangerous. What do you do next? Do you return to the mother church? He says, it seems not. Instead, Protestantism has become an end in itself, even though it's hard to explain from a Protestant point of view why it should exist. The result is denominationalism. Protestant churches that attract an increasingly diminishing market share. It's really a dismaying circumstance. What do you think of that?
Oh, there's a lot there, and I agree with them about the sort of fractious quality of Protestantism, as many people point out. All thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of denominations, multiplying, and that can't be anywhere in the ballpark of what Jesus wants for his church. What do we do after we've won? I mean, first of all, I would contest that Protestantism simply won the day. Let me say this. I go back to Yves Congar, who said famously, if things were a little different in the 16th century, if maybe feelings were a little less intense on both sides of this issue, perhaps there'd be today in the Church Catholic a Lutheran order, as we have an Augustinian and a Dominican and a Franciscan or Jesuit order, right? Namely, a particular group that has a focus, has a special emphasis in the life of the church. And might the emphasis of this Lutheran order, if we could think that way, be something like the primacy of grace? The trouble was things got exaggerated. And I would say Luther and his followers went too far. And they put an end to the prospect of becoming a reforming voice within the church and became a critic now lying outside the church. And that's where I put my finger on the tragedy of it. I think the instinct behind Hauerwas's remark here is that, what's best in the Protestant reform could have and should have remained as a critique movement within the Church Catholic. Paul Tillich, the great Protestant theologian of the 20th century, said there's always the Catholic substance and the Protestant principle, by which he meant the Catholic substance is this keen sense of sacramentalism, that the world is a sign of God, is suffused with God, that we can access God through physical signs and gestures and liturgy, etc. What's the principle? That none of these things simply is God, that all of them to a degree fall short. So there's a great yes and there's a great no. And the balance of that two within the life of the church is a good thing. And I think that's right. The principle ecclesia semper reformanda, right? The church must always be reformed. That's a good Catholic principle. That's not from the 16th century. That's from the church fathers. Ecclesia semper reformanda. The church should always be reformed because we can fall into the danger of different types of idolatry, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how I look at it. It's more along Yves Congar lines of what could have been. And who knows, in God's great providence, what someday might be.
Yeah, and I've heard that several times of the church has always been open to reforming. And you can see, say, in the Franciscans or the Dominicans or many of them that come forth and as a successful within the church type of reforming of spirituality and focus on foundation of Christ and all of that. What would you say are some of the really guiding principles that made those successful and didn't cause this sort of divorce that the Reformation caused?
I'll go out on a limb here, Jared, and say the Eucharist. To me, what the saints all have in common is a deep love of the Eucharist. That's from biblical times until the 21st century. The centrality of the Mass and the Eucharist. That's where I really balk at Luther and the Reformers, is when they started going after the Mass, which they did. When Luther denies the Mass as a sacrifice, something fundamental has been lost. Now, we can argue about real presence in Luther. He has a fairly robust sense of the real presence, but then clearly in the wake of Luther, the reform goes in a much more sort of symbolic direction in regard to the Eucharist. Nope. Now we're off. Now we're on the bad path. Now it's not working. Relationship to Mass and the Eucharist. If that's strong and clear, then I think the reform you propose will probably be a legitimate one and can be incorporated in the life of the church. Another one is fidelity of the Pope. The Pope is the successor of Peter, the rock upon whom Christ built his church. When you say no to Peter, something's gone off the rails. So the great reform movements, as you say, Dominicanism, Franciscanism, the Jesuits, etc., I think fidelity to the Eucharist, the Mass, the Pope, those are some of the signs of what keeps it valid.
And one thing that Hauerwas points out as well is that he says, but I am still a Protestant, even though I'm not sure I know what I'm saying when I say I am a Protestant. And I've heard this from many. I used to work at a parish in RCIA, and many of them had actually never even heard the word Protestant. They would call themselves non-denominational or evangelical or many of these others because they don't see themselves as protesting against anything. Is that the case today in Protestant world?
Yeah, it just depends. And I think you're right. Others prefer, this a more positive sort of characterization because, right, Protestant by its very nature assumes Catholicism. It assumes something that we're against, that we're protesting against. So you might say there's something always parasitical about Protestantism. It depends in a way on Catholic substance. And that was partially Paul Tillich's point. Now, some of that might just be nomenclature. I would urge us to get back to these central issues about grace, about salvation, about the cross, about the Mass, about Eucharist, about the Pope. And, I've been involved in a lot of ecumenical conversations over the years. And I do find, Jared, that when you get back to the great 16th century issues, there's still a lot of disagreement, to be frank about it. Even as, we have vigorously nodded toward the Reformation, and as many Protestants, like Hauerwas, nod toward Catholicism.
Yeah, and one of your most popular videos on YouTube is titled "Protestantism and Authority." In fact, it has over 240,000 views. Talking about these things that we do disagree on. Is authority really kind of the Achilles heel of Protestantism?
It's a way you could say it. See, there's something in Luther it's both charming and naive at the same time. That Luther felt, make the Bible available to the ordinary person, the baptized Christian, free it from its kind of clerical imprisonment, and people will, they'll joyfully come to the faith. And Luther was, I think it's fair to say, convinced there'd be a real consensus that people would read the Bible, they'd all read the same thing, and they'd come to the same conclusions. But even within Luther's own lifetime, it became abundantly clear this was not the case. That, okay, everyone can interpret the Bible, and the result was pretty dramatic disagreement. So what do you do in those cases? Now, this is where I follow John Henry Newman, that the Catholic Church always maintained there has to be a living voice of authority. And to me, the best comparison is an umpire in a baseball game. Oh, take away the umpires. Look, we're all playing baseball here. We all understand baseball. We'll decide who's out and who's safe. How's that going to work out? Anyone that's been around, kids or adults for that matter, playing baseball. No, you need to have not just an authoritative figure, but a living voice on the field to make the call in the moment, or the game won't go on. The game will devolve into bickering. And I think that's a very fair analogy to the Catholic Church's claim that in the bishops and the Pope, we have that living voice of authority that can make a determination. In the absence of that, I think you get this vociferous that we see within the Protestant movement.
Yeah, and just to kind of wrap up about the Hauerwas article, one thing he does say is that the Reformation is over. Do you agree with that?
I'd say yes and no. Mark Knoll writes a book about that. Some very responsible people have kind of opined that way, that, look, aren't these debates basically now a thing of the past? Yes and no, as I've been trying to articulate throughout this show. To a degree, I think we've come to a real common consensus around certain things. Read the famous 1999 statement on justification, where Catholic and Lutheran theologians, came to an agreement about certain features, I would say, of the doctrine of justification. I don't think, frankly, that document solves the problem. I don't think it makes the 16th century debate go away. But progress has been made, for sure. Absolutely.
Well, now it's time for our listener question. Remember, if you have a question for Bishop Barron, go to askbishopbarron.com and record your question from any device, and perhaps you'll be featured on one of our upcoming episodes. Today's question comes from Josh in Virginia, who asked a very poignant question regarding our discussion today.
My name is Josh from Virginia, and my question is about Protestants and how we Catholics should feel about the existence of denominations. Jesus said something to the effect that people who aren't against us are with us, but aren't Protestants by their very nature protesting us and therefore against us? How should we feel about that? Thanks.
Well, in some ways, I think our entire program today has been trying to address that issue. And my answer is basically this yes and no answer. Is Protestantism, by its very nature, a protest movement? Is it standing against Catholicism? Yeah. And to that degree, do we have to stand athwart Protestantism? Yeah, in regard to certain things, I would say. But I like the instinct behind part of that question, which is, if you're not against me, you're for me. And so, are there lots and lots and lots of features of Protestant Christianity that are one with Catholicism? Yeah, sure there are. And so, there I'd say, if you're not against me, you're for me, and we should find those, celebrate them, build. So it's both and. And I found this, Jared, over the years talking about Protestantism. It's always like a minefield, because if you say even one little nice thing about Protestantism, some very conservative Catholics go crazy, and if you are, on the other hand, the least bit critical of parts of Protestantism, people accuse you of not being ecumenical, and so it's a very hard sort of minefield to navigate, I find. But I'm with the Council of Trent, and I'm with Vatican I, and I'm with Vatican II. You want my view? I'd say look at those three great conciliar statements. Council of Trent nods vigorously toward Protestantism, even as it disagrees vigorously. Vatican I has got very strong things to say about modernity and how it's grounded to some degree in the Protestant Reformation. Vatican II, as I was saying, I think has a lot of positive things to say.
All right. Well, thanks so much for tuning into the Word on Fire show. Be sure to check out our website, www.wordonfireshow.com, for several links regarding the topic we discussed today. And can I ask you a favor? If you're enjoying the show, please go to Word on Fire Show podcast on iTunes and leave us a review. The more reviews we get, the more people can hear the word of Bishop Barron and be drawn deeper into the spiritual life. So thanks in advance, and God bless, and we'll see you back here next week on the Word on Fire show.